So now we're going into the final session, the one that considers, and a lot more consideration will have to go into this. Do we do nothing? Do we settle for palliatives? By that, for example, we can illustrate the problem with these green taxes, individual green taxes. They may have a constructive effect, but they also raise the value of neighboring locations and therefore cause a lot of social anguish as part of the process. That's the sort of consequence of taking palliatives. Or do we really go for structural reform? These are the alternatives that the Georgist movement really has to consider. And our first speaker is Roger Sandilands. Roger is an emeritus professor at the Glasgow University, Strathclyde University. But he's taken a deep interest in the Global South events, particularly in Latin America. So he has very wide experience with the consequences of the failure of the financial system in the North and the way it impacts on the South. And following Roger, we've got Bryan Kavanagh in Melbourne. Bryan is in the early hours of his morning, I think. He's stayed up all night to be with us, and thank you very much, Bryan, for that. And his input is really important because Australia adopted what was then called a land tax late in the 19th century. It had no alternative, did it? Because how else could they have funded a new system other than out of the net income? Anyway, Bryan will pick up the story there. But first of all, Roger, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Fred. I want to pick up on a number of points you've made earlier, and in particular focus on your emphasis on the need to create a moral society, which is one in which land is a common birthright, instead of privileging a very small proportion of the upper classes. And that the taxation of labour and entrepreneurship, capital building, is theft. The question then, which has come up in today's discussions, is whether rent is an adequate source of income for the modern society. And so many distinguished economists have suggested that it's a very, very small proportion of national income. It'd be totally inadequate for the financing of a modern state. But that is due to a couple of very, very important misconceptions and departures from the message of Adam Smith, who categorized the nature of the productive elements in our economy as between land, labour and capital as distinct categories. Instead, today, if you look at national income accounts, you see wages, wage incomes, and you see capital incomes. But combined in capital is land. And therefore, anything that land produces as net income, or the physiocrats' surplus over and above the costs of production that are necessary to maintain production, is conflated with profits on enterprise, which is a completely different concept and activity. So we're gravely misled by those who say that there's not enough rental potential to finance the modern state. And we must make the conceptual distinction between land and its rent versus capital and the returns on man-made capital goods, on interest on capital or profits on capital, which is quite different from the rent on land. It's true that for an individual who owns a house or a business that owns the land upon which a shop or a factory is located, it represents for him or her an asset like capital, it's their capital. But it's a fallacy of composition to believe that what's true of the individual, in that sense of saying that my house is my capital and my factory and the land it sits on is my capital, as opposed to what's true of the whole of society. What's true of the individual is not necessarily true of the society. That's the fallacy of composition that you may be guilty of. Rent itself is just a transfer payment. When you sell land or transfer it or its use, it's merely a transfer payment. You're not creating any more land by buying it, because land is fixed in supply, and that's a crucial and underlying concept, the fixity of the supply of land, its immobility and its fixity, which means that as the price of land, whether it's capital value or its annual rental value, goes up, unlike if you're trying to bring the price of wheat down to its marginal cost of productions, you just increase the supply of wheat. But if you try to reduce the price of land by increasing the supply of land, you can't do it. And you can't move it from where land is very high priced in the centre of London to where in the back of beyond it's maybe nearly worthless. So that's very important to bear in mind. You cannot counteract a high or rising price by increasing the supply of land. Its supply is fixed. And that's where one of our 4 or 5 very recent prime ministers in the United Kingdom, Liz Truss, made a fatal error. She believed that just by cutting taxes, all taxes of whatever description, she would promote greater growth in the economy through stimulating and motivating more enterprise. However, by cutting taxes on whatever, but maintaining government spending at its current levels, or even trying to increase public spending, you're going to end up with major fiscal deficits, which is what caused great anxiety in the world bond markets and so on. And she was forced to abandon that scheme after about 45 days in office. The problem was the anxiety that she caused in the markets, plus the need to finance whatever government spending was to be continued by printing the money to finance it. But just printing more money doesn't create wealth. It just creates inflation if the growth of the money supply exceeds the growth of the real productive activity in the economy, which nothing that she did really enhanced, even though she thought it was going to do. What she and others need to understand, as Mason Gaffney has importantly emphasised, is the notion that all taxes come out of rent. So if you tax business and work, if you therefore tax earned incomes, you reduce the amount of money that can be spent on land, and hence the amount of rent that's available for collecting. The one is the obverse of the other. And that must be understood, that the at core principle that all taxes come out of rent and all benefits tend to lead to bigger rents on the opposite hand. So what we must do is to restructure the fiscal system so that it's not just a matter of increasing the collection of rents, but it's a matter of coupling the increase in the revenue taken out of those who are earning or owning rents, or the capital values of rents, by a reduction in the taxation, using that word in its proper meaning, the taxation of earned incomes by labour and by entrepreneurial capitalists. And only if you do that way will you stimulate and motivate increased effort, fuller employment, greater innovation, greater risk-taking on the part of capitalists, innovating capitalists, and get growth that way. So you've got to couple the reduction in the revenues you get from land, rather, couple the revenues you get from taxing earned incomes by increasing the rent revenues raised by virtue of insisting that those people who own or get rent from land or location values that element should be raised. So it's a re-switching, a restructuring of the fiscal system that's required, not simply cutting taxes in order to stimulate growth, if that implies fiscal deficits, because deficits have got to be covered somehow, and typically they're covered by the printing press, which is very dangerous and typically inflationary, followed by variations in the interest rate, which in particular, as Ed Dodson has emphasised, creates great instability in the mortgage markets, and those institutions that specialise in mortgage-backed securities, giving rise to the kind of drastic shocks to the system and depressions that we experienced in the 1970s, for example. Just very quickly, lastly, in the UK press, just this last days, a prominent Italian-American economist at University College London, Mariana Mazzucato, has been arguing for the creation of a national wealth fund. This national wealth fund, she thinks, like the green revenue system, would be spent on giving contracts to people involved in the projects that are associated with the spending of this national wealth fund, and that they, she says, will enjoy monopoly profits from, or certainly profits, and she tends to see them as monopoly profits that derive from the spending of this national wealth fund. And so she says these monopoly profits are immoral and need to be taxed. But why not? That degree of monopoly is relatively trivial compared to the much broader concept of monopoly land pricing. And so why doesn't she generalize her condemnation of enterprise profits, calling them almost always monopoly profits, which is debatable anyway, and generalize the concept to where it's most applicable and most relevant and most important, namely the capture of the net income of society that should belong to us all and should be the primary source of state revenue, to replace the disincentivizing, demoralizing taxes, which are real taxes, as opposed to which are things that people pay without any obvious immediate benefit. Instead, we should be paying for what we make, that is to say, the product of our labour and of our enterprise and our innovations, as opposed to paying instead paying for what we take, in the sense that where we live is where all kinds of public provided services pay for out of taxes under the current system, under predominantly taxes on earned incomes, so that we can have both growth and equity and fairness and efficiency and dynamism, which creates a cumulative causation effect, whereby the growth that does generate is then going to increase the demand for labour and enterprise, but also the demand for land. The former, labour and capital, can increase their supply and if they're taxed too heavily, they'll move, they'll go abroad or stop working. But if you do the same with respect to land, whereby you collect as much as possible of the unearned income of rent, which reflects what people are taking from the system, then you have a greater dynamism, which is self-reinforcing, sustainable and equitable, non-inflationary because it's backed by real wealth creation. And that's what we have to seek. And that's what we have to convince the public that is required. A restructuring of the fiscal system away from penalising production towards taking what is the community-created net income or rent, location rent on both natural resources and, most importantly, the rents which are concentrated in our cities, our towns, and particularly the big cities. That's where the real injustice lies, not in the community buyout problem of so-called land reform, which is the focus of the Scottish government in recent years, whereby the government spends money instead of getting money in, they're spending money to buy land for communities who claim we have a community here and we need to own it and expel the current landowners. And that's not that's not what we understand in the Georgist movement as land reform. Quite often the contrary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Before I invite Bryan to make his presentation, I want to ask Roger a question which he can mull over, and we'll come back to his answer after Bryan has made his presentation. You're saying, Roger, that approximately half of national income is the rental revenue from all sources. Now, the question that I'd like to pose to you is this. If the whole of current government spending was funded by a direct charge on rents in all their forms, that would still leave half of the rent of the nation in private pockets. What are the implications of that? Would you say that we've solved all our social, economic and environmental problems if we cover all of existing tax or all existing government funding commitments out of rent? Is that sufficient, or would it still leave rental revenue in private pockets to create havoc in the way that they're doing at the present time? If you could reflect on that, we'll come back to you after Bryan. Bryan, it's your turn to talk about one of the really interesting cases of the application of a land tax, as it's called, in Australia. Please go ahead. Bryan,
Thanks, Fred.
I should
Thanks,
say,
Fred.
before you do, Bryan, I should remind people that Bryan has been a practitioner in the real estate sector all his life. If you tell him you can't value land separately from buildings, he will just laugh at you because he's had a lifetime of experience of doing precisely that. Okay, Bryan, you're speaking from Melbourne. Thank you very much for staying up all night to be able to address to us as our last speaker.
5:03 in the morning here, Fred. First of all, it is a pleasure to be a guest of the Henry George School of Social Science. Thank you. Contrary to economics textbooks, I want to suggest all the world is rent and we are merely payers. But to whom we pay it? Henry George's public capture remedy to replace pathological extraction of taxes from incomes and purchases is a scientific explanation. It explains the cause of industrial depression and of increase of want with increase of wealth. And aren't we seeing the latter now? Since the Power in the Land in 1983, You, Fred, have taken George's analysis to another level by patiently documenting the timing of these disastrously bursting bubbles in land prices. They do represent a deep socio-economic illness, certainly not the natural business cycle. So we need to call out the upcoming 2027 financial collapse as part of a recurring scandal. We're presented with the unique opportunity to do so, not to do nothing, nor to resort to worthless palliatives, but to argue for structural reform, the abolition of misbegotten tax regimes, and demonstrating that the 18-year boom-bust cycle acts only to serve privilege. The essence of any scientific explanation is accurate forecast. Thanks to Fred's work, we may embark on talking truth to power about the upcoming 2026-27 bubble burst and what an enormous one is shaping up for a likely President Trump to oversee. With social media linking us all now, we need to throw our weight behind Fred and others making headway in calling the upcoming taxation and land price-induced financial collapse. The subtitle of George's Progress and Poverty entreats us to do so. In going through the 1920s copies of the Australian George's magazine Progress, I found no prognostication about an upcoming Great Depression. In my opinion, that was a gross failure. Were we not experiencing the evidence, a feel for the times such as now? Something's happening. I think we know we're at a watershed. Ironically, the only foreboding of economic depression came from a non-Georgist, Mr. R.G. Menzies. Progress Journal of the 1st of December 1929 cited Menzies when standing for public office in 1928. Since the war, we have suffered from an unnatural prolongation of post-war inflation of land values, keeping up land values at an artificial level. Where's the politician today that's going to make a statement like that? And I think he made it because he was a lawyer, not an economist. Economists are not allowed to forecast because economics is not a science. R.G. Menzies went on to become Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister from 1949 to 1966. And by the way, Roger and Ian, Menzies let it be known that the correct Scottish pronunciation of Menzies was Menzies. I'd just like to share the quantum of the good news. This GDP time series chart, beginning in 1911, is based upon Dr. Terry Dwyer's The Taxable Capacity of Australian Land and Resources in the 2003 refereed academic journal, Australian Tax Forum. Engineer and maths whiz Dr. Gavin Putland extended it to 2018 in his paper Trickle Up Economics for Prosperous Australia in 2019. Along with other excellent research, this paper can be found on Prosperous Australia's website. As the heading on the chart shows, this is Australia's estimated after-tax distribution of GDP. Taxes are shown in red, land rent in dark blue, that's strictly ground rent. Realised capital gains in green, and the net returns to labour and capital are the disappearing pale blue. If we accept that all taxes and their excess burden come out of rent, ATCOR and EBCOR, all but the pale blue net incomes of labour and capital is economic rent. It was 50% in 2018. That's an enormous amount and suggestive of from whence a citizen's dividend may come to deal with increasing poverty and dispossession over the next few years. The universal income amounts to a direct deduction from currently expropriated economic rent. It is not inflationary. The true inflation is the cost push from our land prices and taxes. 2018 land rent was 16%, the dark blue, and taxes and realised capital gains for the other 34%. That it's twice the value of land rent is in close accord with Martin Feldstein's estimation of excess burden for income tax, also with my separate assessment for all taxes, which was based on removal of real estate bubbles. The late Dr. Fred Foldberry approved my assessment against a challenge on Fred Harrison's website. The chart is an estimate. It has limitations. There's double counting in economic rent, insofar as taxation includes a very small amount of publicly captured rent, whereas the dark blue is the estimated total land rent. More than offsetting that, though, the pale blue still includes untaxed super profits from monopolies such as banking, social media, and the e-commerce giants. Conversely, the public capture of economic rent taxes are doubly perverse. Not only do they extract from earned incomes and get passed off into the price of goods and services, but to the extent that land rent is allowed to be privatised, it is capitalised into real estate spec and impossible mortgage debt. So there's the double whammy. Regardless of well-meaning tax transfers, the taxing of incomes and purchases represents excess burden and deadweight loss, and explains at this critical point in history why the world is tacking into a 2027 depressionary abyss. Georgists have a scientific explanation to address this. We needn't be shy about it. This is the moment to press urgently for a tax shift to rents. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. So, Roger, Bryan's data based on national statistics that draw heavily on reliable data on the value, the rental income of land, shows that certainly in the 21st century, half of the revenue goes to labour and capital. The other half is, in its various guises, attributable to rents, which is what you argue from theoretically. So the question is this: if a government suddenly was able to raise all the revenue it needed to cover current public spending, that would still leave half of the rental income of the nation in private pockets, would that seriously diminish the deadweight consequences that are currently being endured by the rich nations of the West? Can you offer your reflections on that question?
Well, Fred, I think that the deadweight losses can also arise from government intervention in the economy. And to the extent that government intervenes with all kinds of controls and so on, or nationalisation programmes covering the railway network, for example, or whatever, steel industry, whether that's efficient. We can debate those issues, but if it turns out that those issues suggest that the size of government is too big, then we should deal with those particular inefficiencies and autocratic interventions that depart from a free market system and free market pricing. But if it turns out that the amount of rent, if all of it is taken by the government, is insufficient to finance all of the justifiable expenditures by government, then, as I say, if it's too little, then we would have to either cut government spending to that which is most efficient, or raise other kinds of taxes, which could be deleterious in terms of growth and hence future government opportunities. So we have to decide whether the proportion of government spending is too big or too small relative to GDP and production. And if it turns out that rent, as you're kind of implying, could exceed the normal and justifiable types of government expenditure, then there's a case which I think Bryan has just alluded to, namely social dividend, just sharing out the excess revenues that are not needed for essential government services and distributing it evenly amongst the whole population, the social dividend, so that rents are returned in that way to society, and in a justifiable way that is not theft, but rather is promotion of morality in our economic and political systems.
Okay, thank you. And if I may ask Bryan a question that implies a similar economics to the one I put to Roger. Bryan, if the Australian government did decide to levy or elevate its land tax so that it covered all of current government spending, it would still leave a lot of rent in private hands. Your argument is that rent should be funding a universal basic income, right?
I am. I think if you look at those figures, because the net returns to labour and capital at 2018 was showing only 50%, that was loaded up still with untaxed super profits from monopolies. But therefore, there is plenty fed, and Henry George seemed to have a feeling there would be plenty left over. I think that shows there is an enormous amount left over. And if we are heading into depression, and you've sold me on it, Fed, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. If we're having a depression, why shouldn't we give people money? It's not inflationary. What is inflationary? And Georgia should know what is inflationary. It's land price and taxes. It is not inflationary to put money in people's hands, particularly in a depression. So I think that is an immediate deduction from rent. But at the same time, we must argue that we must transition gradually as well, bit by bit, to taking as much rent as we can, not just the land rent, but we can keep taking rent. And we will find that rent grows and we can continue to grow by taking rent. I don't know where the optimum ultimate level is, but the point is we've got to do it, and it's got to be seen as a switch from taxation to rents. We've got high-level people. We've had Ken Henry, who wrote the Australia's Future Tax System. That's still mouldering in the cupboards. He had a case for getting land rent. Last year's speaker at the Henry George dinner was Ross Garner. He was Bob Hawke's economic advisor. He spoke at the dinner last year. He actually broke his ankle in the morning riding a bicycle, but he still came to speak to us that evening. We had to carry him up the stairs, and he gave a speech in favour of rent that would stir people. After all these years, he was always pro-rent because he couldn't do it under Hawke, but now he's prepared to speak out. And not only that, but we've had a switch in Canberra. We're more than halfway through a switch from stamp duty to land tax. And in New South Wales, we've made it optional that you can either opt to pay stamp duty or land tax. And we're convinced that if that continues, then most people see it's in their advantage. But that's still only grabbing a little bit, Fed. We've got to think the overarching principle that you're pushing, tax switch from taxes to rents.
Thank you. David Chester's asking a question. I'll put it to our panelists. He says, why can't people be required to sell their land when they're ready to relieve themselves of the land to the government, whenever that may be? Quite apart from the problem that postpones putting into effect the solutions to a constructive fiscal reform now, do governments really have the resources to buy back the land when at the moment they can't even fund enough schools, teachers, they can't fund enough policemen to enforce law and order, and all the rest of the shortcomings? How would they then end up having the resources to buy back the land from landowners?
Could I take this, because I think I disagree both with Roger and you on this one. But they can fund the NHS. They can do these things. Government spending, it may be done in areas where it's not just pumping asset prices. Henry George himself was a fan of Abraham Lincoln. He saw how he funded the Civil War. When money was running low, Salmon Chase said to him, "This is $1 million a day. Haven't got the money." And Lincoln said, "Run the printing presses." And that's what they did. They funded it because it was done on hard and fast stuff. Yes, it might have created debt, but the government spends before it taxes back. We've got to understand that. And this austerity business, Georges should not be promoting that. Governments are enforcing austerity so the rent seekers can keep grabbing at the rents. Governments spend where they should, and we tax back properly through rents. There's more than enough for universal basic income, which again is a direct deduction from stolen rents, expropriated rents. So I don't think we've got to be backward in coming forward. I'm pushing on. I disagree with MMT, but I've made friends in the MMT field. I've made a couple of enemies too. And in the UBI field, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I'm pressing Vimmelbutt. That's the combination of MMT, LVT, and UBI. And I really do think that it should not be beyond Georges. We've got to keep our point going through all this. There are some people in MMT don't quite get LVT. There are some people in UBI don't. But that doesn't mean we can't have friends. It's a big. We're on a big mission at a very important part of history, and I think we do have to look just outside our borders a little. And that's why I agreed with Chris Fred, on the MMT aspect. I've got recrimination. I don't like the job guarantee. That's coercive. But I think a UBI, particularly at a time of depression, putting money in people's hands, it is an immediate direct deduction. We've got to say that's not good enough. We also want to transition from taxes to rent.
Thanks, Bryan.